And then let me share the screen so that we can talk about the tree installation and selection and establishment, because that's going to be a very important component for the class and for you to know so that you can begin to recommend some trees. And so it is not uncommon for people to ask me, like, could you recommend me a tree for me? And like, yeah, well, there's going to be a lot of things that we need to take into consideration and make sure that the tree is placed in the right location and to ensure that the tree is going to have a happy, healthy, and a prolonged life. And also that the tree is going to be providing whatever is it that you are looking from it. And so we have just an image here of a house that is surrounded by tree. Obviously, we like to have trees around the living areas, the landscape, and some of the trees are going to lend themselves well to that, and a few of them will not. So we'll get to go over many of the different things that we should be considering. So here is a house that decided to create a nice grove. So we have several sycamores, we have some jacarandas, we have an ash tree on the far left. And so they have created a very nice area for the trees to be planted. They have the space and the house is far away. So they have created their own little forest with trees. And or sometimes they may opt to have just one. The area may lend itself the space for having just one tree, and that's what they want. They want that focal point, that iconic tree that is going to be above the house. Uh, Deciduous versus evergreen. And so that is going to be a very important question. And why is that? Because we know that the deciduous trees are going to drop their leaves. So that could be kind of helpful during the winter. During the winter time, when the tree last drop their leaves, it's going to get colder. That takes advantage of the sunlight, the minimum amount of sunlight and heat to help heat up the house. And so it's going to save on energy because you're taking the advantage of the sunlight. So during the winter, some people may choose to plant a deciduous tree that is going to drop the leaves to help with heating the house or the property. And during the summer, when it's very hot out here, the trees are going to leaf out and then they're going to provide the shade for cooling down the house. And so that would be one of the first things that people might want to plant a tree for, to save energy by uh, having an evergreen or a deciduous tree. Obviously, the evergreen tree is not going to lend itself as well as a deciduous. So that would be one reason why a deciduous tree may be selected or maybe more favorable for that type of condition. Also, the shade. It is important for you to understand how much shade is going to be provided by the tree. So not all the trees, and this is also going to have to do with the length of the day and the position of the sun. But the size itself of the tree will play a major role. And so here's just some drawings from a small, medium, and large tree. You see the radius of how far or how many feet that tree may be able to cast a shadow onto those homes. And so as the tree gets smaller, obviously that's going to change. And also as the sun is getting above the houses or above the horizon during the afternoon, it's going to be a little bit more sunny and the tree will have to compensate for it. So be aware of that. So when you're going to be planting a tree or selecting a tree, where the sun comes from, the east, and as it progresses, is there a particular time when you want shade the most? Most often people would want to have some kind of shade during the afternoon when it gets really hot as the sun is setting. That's when they want some kind of protection. So be aware of that. And so when you are going to be asked, so can you recommend me a tree? These are some of the questions that I would ask them to give me information on. So why is the tree being planted? Trees should be planted for a reason. It is not just, oh, I love trees. Yeah, that's very good. but is there something that you want? Is it for shade? Is it for fruit? Is it for the color that we keep talking about? The windbreak, a screen. What's the purpose of the tree? Do you just want a tree? Great, great. That is the purpose. So it might be some kind of psychological benefit. But ultimately, we might need a tree for some of the other benefits, like shade would be most of the common thing. So, why is the tree being planted? What is the purpose of the tree? That would be question number one. The second question is, what is the size and the location? Because obviously, people want to have a tree right here and they want a gigantic one. The location might be not be suitable, or the size of the tree they want is not realistic. And that's where we're going to come into the problem with people wanting to have a big tree in a very small yard, and there's not going to be it's going to be problematic for the tree later on. So the size, if you're able to visit the size and determine how much space is available to the tree, that would be great. The soil condition. Are we having soils that are going to be very dry? Is there going to be irrigation? Is there other problems with the soil that I do not know? That should also be taken into consideration. Is this soil going to be close to the ocean where there might be some influence from the salt from the sea? That might be encourage some kind of salt tolerant tree, or is it going to be somewhere closer to the mountains where it might not be a lot of soil, and the soil layer is going to be very thin? That's very, very important. And then the type of maintenance that the person is willing to put to the tree. Every single tree will require some kind of maintenance. There's no such thing as a maintenance free tree or a maintenance free landscape. They all are living organisms. They have biological needs and biological waste, and there's always going to be some kind of maintenance associated with it. So if they're not willing to put a lot of effort into the tree, then some of the trees that are require less care would be the ideal. Otherwise, if they're willing to work with the tree and shape it, then they can have anything they want. So the maintenance of the tree is going to be very important, as well as the maintenance during the establishment period. Most people think that planting a tree means just digging a hole and put it in the ground, and the answer is no. There is a 3 to 4 year time for the tree to become established. During that period, when the tree gets planted and then it becomes established, it will require regular care. It will require a lot more water because it's going to be get established. It needs to have the roots growing into the substrate. And during that time, if it dries out, it could suffer some serious problems. And so it will take several years for that tree to become established. Once the roots have grown into the surrounding soil or substrate, then the tree can slowly be taken away from the normal care, and then it's going to be on its own. Keeping in mind that if this was a tree in nature, nature takes care of them. But because they're cultivated, they're growing in a container, they are going to require time and acclimation so that they can be by themselves or be able to survive by themselves. So yes, you cannot just plant a tree and run away from it. You have to water it, keep it moist until it becomes established. And that is going to be part of the maintenance. Some people just want to dig up hole and plant the tree and walk away from it. That is not going to be good for the tree. So the maintenance following the planting, the maintenance as a care and training, and the maintenance afterwards, because a tree might need some kind of help after the matter for branches that might be growing in the wrong directions. So these are some of the questions that I would ask the person when they ask, could you recommend me a tree? And then based on what their answer is, then I can have a better idea as to maybe X, Y, and Z tree would be good for this area. So here's just some examples. Many people want avocados, and so here's an avocado tree in the front yard. It's doing its job. Obviously, the maintenance is not as good because it still has metal stakes. So somebody did not do a follow-up care, and the metal stakes are still holding the tree, or at least still attached to the tree. So enjoying the fruit, but the tree is not getting any benefits. Or sometimes they just want a very small tree to frame some kind of structure, in this case, a water fountain. So we have white alder trees that will do just that. Very simple, very simplistic, very small. Here is something perfect for what they're trying to achieve. So looking at the soil site, so I have an idea of they want a tree. Now I'm going to check the site. I'm going to go and look at where is it that they want the tree. And so when I go and visit the site, I'm going to look at the soil. I'm going to look at what kind of soil they have. Once again, irrigation. I'm going to make sure that I checked on that because if not, somebody knows who's going to have to water by hand. And humans are not as dependable as an irrigation system. I'm going to look for the exposure. Is this going to be a sun area or sunny area, or is it going to be shade? Is it between two buildings? Also, if there's going to be wind, there's going to be wind tunnels in certain part of the city. Is this an area prone to winds? There's also going to be the Santa Ana winds that may have a problem, especially when young, that can dry out the tree. I'm going to look at the human activity. What is the area being used for? Is it going to be a yard where the children are going to play? Is it just going to be a side area where there's nothing really happening? Or is it going to be close to an area where people are going to walk or hang out? So the human activity for the area is going to be very important. The drainage, meaning how well is the water moving, or where's the water going to move towards? Moving the water away from the house is going to be very important. So is the area has good drainage, or is it going to be a hole somewhere where the water is just going to pool and accumulate and create a swamp during the rainy season, which is going to be good for some trees like willows, but not good for others. So the drainage is going to be another thing that I would like to check. The space, how much space? And this is going to always be the problem that unfortunately in an urban scenario, the space is going to be very limited. Houses are going to be built close to one another. Apartments, multi-story apartment buildings are going to be built next to houses, and it's going to prevent the trees from branching out and having enough space to grow. So how much space is this tree potentially going to be able to grow out, and that's going to help with determining the tree. And then the hardiness, obviously around here, that is not going to be a big problem around Southern California because we're able to grow many trees. But if we look at somewhere else, maybe more inland, that when it gets colder and hotter, that is going to push me back on certain trees that I might want or might recommend. Or as you move further away, back east, up north, where it will get cold, then that will help out with determining the type of trees that you can plant. Uh, when somebody asks me, can you recommend me a tree for Oregon, Washington? Obviously, I do not have a lot of experience in those states or back east. So the first thing that I would ask them is, or recommend to them, is you should go wherever you're going to think about moving and look at the trees that are there. Because that's going to give you a good idea of what is going to be already suitable for your area. So look around and you're probably going to find a tree that you want, and then you can just find out what that tree is, and then you can just get it from your local area. But the trees that are going to be able to grow here in Southern California, we can grow over 500 different trees. That's not going to be the case with Europe, that may have maybe about 10-ish, or Eastern US that is going to have also a very limited amount because of the cold problem with them, or the cold weather, not a problem. So the hardiness, that's also going to be very important for you to understand. And so here's just a drawing on some of the things that we just listed. So we're going to have the wind, and again, there's going to be many areas inland that are going to get battered by the wind every afternoon. And so this is where the windscreen may come in handy. I keep mentioning windscreen, so not a big problem here in Long Beach, but inland they do have a problem with very strong winds on a regular basis. Some of the existing plants that they're going to compete with the tree, you should also kind of make a note of them. The pH or any other problem associated with the construction. And that is very important that when you are trying to determine what to plant here and there, if you can find the history of the construction in that area, it's going to be very important because we know that the construction companies do not want to spend money in any disposal fee. So every so often they'll just bury things. And as you're digging, you're going to find surprises. So they might have buried a lot of lime that they use for the project, maybe some cement. And so an area that you think was a good place for the tree to be will not be because of whatever is hidden underneath, as well as pipes, as well as electrical lines, and as well as any other things. The good thing about many of those things that if you call the Dig Alert, one of those companies that want to make sure that you don't break anything ahead of time, they'll let you know where the pipes are running or some of the hidden things if they have that knowledge. Sometimes they don't. So that could change depending on what you find and or whatever has been hidden that is going to change the soil. The compaction, it is not uncommon for machineries to go into an area for building houses, delivering supplies and stuff like that. So having soil is going to be, good soil is going to be very important. If you're not able to drive the shovel to make the hole, you know you have a soil compaction problem and you might want to remediate that or help it along so that the tree can have a better chance of surviving. The movement of the sun is also going to be very important, as well as any kind of electrical line, power line, anything that is overhead where the tree is going to be growing towards or interfering with is going to be a big problem for the tree, and the tree is going to lose. So just some of the things to consider. So here is just a perfect example of trees that have been protected. So there is a very important concept that you need to be aware of, and that is going to be the concept of wind throw. And so what happened with the sycamores, they were planted in a park. There were other trees in the vicinity surrounding them. And the trees for many years protected the sycamores. They protected from the wind and other environmental factors. So that I don't want to say that makes the tree a little bit weak, but it does protect the trees. And so when those trees that were being the protectors were removed for natural death or natural causes, that exposed the trees that were protected now to the open air and the environment. And when the right wind came along, it literally snapped them in half. And that's what we have here. We have a sycamore. Had nothing wrong with it. I mean, ideally, the tree was very happy and healthy, protected from the elements. And so it just snapped and broke. And so this might be a problem because you are or the person may be surrounded by neighbors who have a lot of trees. And if those neighbors prune or remove their trees, that could put your tree into this kind of situation where it may get just thrown by the wind. And that's where the word comes from. So be aware. Trees can protect each other. Trees over time can depend on one another. And if something happens, then this was an unfortunate consequence of removing the trees that were surrounding, that were protecting them. So wind throw is something that you should be familiar with. And or as trees get planted on the coast, there's going to be the prevailing wind in the afternoon. So here is Point Fermin or in Pedro. And you see the pine trees are growing towards one direction. They had to adapt to the winds that would come every afternoon. So this is where the tree is going to be shaped by the environment, and in this case, it's going to be the wind. So growing in one direction is not that beautiful open tree that you want, but you have things that you have to work and deal with. So the prevailing wind from the ocean every afternoon. And the light. So here is just a schematic of trees and how far should they be planted from the house. So you have the house. And so you have the normal yard. And I mentioned before to try to keep trees at least 15 feet away from the house if possible. Again, putting it next to the house is not a good idea as the tree grows is going to interfere with the branches or the roots. And so you have an area that is going to be several feet away from the house that can potentially house some kind of large tree. If this is also on the west side, it can help the house by shading it during the afternoon sunlight. And then as you get closer to the house at about 12 meters or 40, here you can have a medium-sized tree. And as you get closer to the power lines and the sidewalk, you might also want to look at smaller trees. So that's why there's that book, The Street Trees of Southern California, that they want to make sure that they don't use some of the larger trees because the larger trees are going to grow into the house, sorry, into the lights and the cables, and then there's going to be problems with it. So the further away you are from the house, then the possibility of having the larger trees becomes more possible. The closer you are to the house, the smaller the trees that you should plant, and then kind of guess from there. In the same manner, the closer you are to the utility line, the smaller the tree should be, and the more you move away from it, then the tree gets bigger. So here's the utility lines. Again, we have the roots that might interfere with the post. And so when you have the utility line, a small tree can be planted anywhere within the 15 feet away. And then maybe a medium-sized tree that is upright can be planted maybe about 20 feet away from the post or the lines. And then the larger trees that will have the bigger canopies should be planted about 40 feet from the light posts or the lights and the lines. And then that also tells you the size of the tree so that you don't get the big ones next, because that's going to be probably a very horrible eyesore. Here's a street, and you see trees growing through or around the lines. Uh, Most of the bottom lines are just going to be communication lines, so that's not going to be a big problem. And I'm going to say that knowing that if somebody were to cut them by accident, it's going to be a lot of money for somebody to go there and repair them. In most instances, when some a tree like this needs to be pruned, it is the company who gets called, either the light company or the communications company, so that they ensure that the lines are going to be safe and not get cut. Or the higher lines are going to be the electrical lines. Obviously, if you are going to be pruning around them, you need to stay away from the electrical lines because there has been many incidents where somebody accidentally cuts one of those lines and the electrical current is going to go to their body and it's going to kill them. So here's where some of those concepts were not really followed. You have very large trees already growing into the power lines and into the communications line. We know the urban forest is very important. I wish that all these lines were below the ground or somewhere away from the trees, but in most cases, those lines were already placed and the trees will follow. But you don't need to have big trees next to the power lines if you could avoid them. And here's American sweet gum, and you can see that they have been heavily pruned on the top. Heavily pruned because they don't want them to get any taller. And this is unfortunately why many of these trees that you see along the streets are pruned very heavily every 7 to 8, maybe 10 years. That is because they don't want to be coming back to them every single year. There's no way, or the city claims that they cannot put them on a regular yearly cycle where they're going to train them and shape them and prune them properly. So they go there, prune them very heavily so that they don't have to go back to them maybe in several years. And then they go back and reprune them again very heavily. It's convenient for them, not for the tree. And that's what we're trying to avoid by planting the right tree in the right location. So very heavily topped trees, and some of the branches are already growing, and I'm sure those will be removed later on. Or here's very low level lines and you have trees already growing through them. Obviously, that's not going to be good for the trees. So this is where we have the different forms and the sizes of the tree. We already know the size. Trees that are 15 to 30 feet are going to be kind of small. 30 to 50, 60 feet are going to be medium. And anything about that is going to be a large tree. And so assuming the tree is going to be allowed to grow properly or train properly, then they may have different types of forms and or sizes. We've already seen many of this. We have the pyramid, just like a Christmas tree. We have here like a full crown. We have the vase shape where the branches come out from the area. Next time we'll see that Grevillea robusta, it has this full crown shape. We have the fountain like the palm. We have the spreading, so where the branches just kind of go in different directions and semi-round, but it's not like a complete ball. We have the columnar, and then we have the layer where you may have like clouds being made by the tree, or then we have the weeping type. And what tree is, what form is the optimum? It depends on the situation. Some people like one over the other, and often the space might be limiting. So it's just that's why you visit the site and you determine what tree might be good for what location. So here we have in photographs some of the trees that I have come across. So if we look at a pyramidal, again, very narrow, we've seen many of them. Here is what looks like a coast redwood growing just natural form. That's a nice pyramid, very narrow. It's not going to interfere with anything. So sometimes that situation calls for something like this. Here we have the full crown. Again, just very almost round branches spreading, but none of the branches are just going away from the general form of the tree. So the full crown individual. Here we have the vase shape. So you have the stem and then all of these lateral branches or scaffold branches are going to come out from one point, creating this almost vase-like shape on the pattern with a very nice canopy. The palm shape, fountain shape, it's going to be all the different palms or palm-like that we've talked about. And then here we have the spreading where we have the branches that are going to be further out and growing away from the stem. Notice you don't have all the branches coming from one point, or at least they don't form that vase shape. You have branches going out and up in different directions. Here we have the layer tree, so and you can see through it. So there's a cloud of leaves here, another cloud here, another cloud here in different areas. So this would be the example of the layered typed tree that that's a camphor tree. Here's more of an intense pruning. This is the Brazilian pepper, also kind of layered, kind of well trained to showcase the stems and the branches. And you see the different groupings of leaves throughout the tree. Or we have the columnar, the column shape. That's the Araucaria that we've seen, also very narrow. And obviously the Italian cypress would be the better example for this. Or we have the weeping. So here is a weeping willow as a street tree, and just has a very nice canopy. And then those branch hoppings that I mentioned before that you see right here on the side, that is just going to produce the next branch. So again, different choices. Some people might like one over the other, but the situation and the area and the site and the purpose should help in determining what type of tree you want to plant. Here's some things just to consider. You should not put a columnar tree where there's a window, because now you're going to have to allow for the light to go into the window, and they're going to have to raise the canopy. Now that looks really ugly. So if you're going to have a columnar tree that you're going to have leaves from bottom to top, then somewhere where you don't need to prune it would be the ideal. Putting trees that are going to be too wide on a narrow area, now you're going to interfere in this case with the traffic or the sidewalk. That's going to be a problem. So in that case, you might want to put something that is going to be more of a narrow type canopy that is not going to interfere with traffic. So just things to consider: wrong tree, wrong location. The purpose is not there. Walking areas. So if there's going to be an area for people to meander, so obviously the trees that can grow higher or have a much uh, higher canopy would be good. Here's just a schematic of the fern pine and the coast live oak, some of the larger trees, and how they can serve as a good area for people to meander. So walking areas will definitely have some nice canopy, and maybe the trees can meet, creating a nice natural tunnel. So that's going to be good for them. Things to consider: the root damage potential. We keep talking about it because, yes, trees are going to damage the foundation of many things. We already know that the roots are going to be on top. And that's why you want to make sure that if you have a ficus or something with very severe root damage potential, that you don't put it next to cement, you don't put it next to the sidewalk. Here in the parking lot, they're already lifting some of the asphalt or the tarmac. So keep in mind something like this because that's going to be important. Also, things to consider. You don't think about having some kind of fruit flowers. Again, that's going to be good. That could be bad. Sometimes flowering trees are going to be good. Also, spines and prickles. We know the silk floss has a lot of spines and prickles. And if there's a lot of children in an area or playing around it, that might not be good. So those are things to consider. The maintenance in regarding to the fruits. Again, I don't want to bad mouth fruits, but if somebody does not have the maintenance regime to rake the fruits ahead of time, then that's going to become a serious problem. And also, obviously, fruit will invite animals. Some people might not like to have possums in their surroundings, or it's going to have some flies, other insects that are going to be feeding on the fruits. If you don't eat them, somebody else will, and that's going to cause some other problems. So part of the maintenance regime: flowers versus fruits versus maybe prickles versus some of the root system that will have may damage an area. So other things to keep on considering. And so here's just a simple uh, checkoff list that, again, this is just a generic one that you can take around as you are walking around and looking at the site and then kind of selecting the trees. You can look at some of these things on the left, like thorns. Where's the wind coming from? Is the fruit going to be messy? What's the soil like? What's the mature size of the tree? And then you can then begin to narrow your selection. So you can make yourself something like this depending on what you're going to be recommending to somebody. And also some kind of lighting. It is Lighting is not often used, but it should be used a lot more because trees could be very nice during the night. And so having some kind of lighting from below, or sometimes putting lights on the actual trees and attaching them to the branch where you highlighting the stem or some of the leaves or some of the other features of the tree will be very nice. So sometimes people might want to appreciate their area a lot more during the night. And so having some of these lights installed might be something very good. And so here's some of the white birch, beautifully lit, or sometimes the light that is going to cast or reflect a shadow onto a wall that creates a very nice feeling. So lighting could also be another very good feature that you need to take into consideration when selecting trees. So here's a small tree. Obviously, this is a fruit tree. Here's a guava that was planted. Good for the area, not really messing with anything. Here's a much bigger pineapple guava. Also very nice for its location, just perfect, small, also big enough for people to still be able to harvest the fruit. And that's another very important feature. People want the fruit. Make sure that you don't get a 60-foot trees where they're not going to be able to go climb the tree and get the fruit. So things that are small will be better, or they can be kept small. Here's the Yucca guatemalensis and also a very small strawberry guava here. Again, small tree next to the house here is not going to be a big problem because it's not going to have a severe root damage. Or some of the flowers. So here are some magnolias. This is Magnolia salingiana or the saucer magnolia. It's deciduous, and during the spring, it's going to get completely covered with flowers. Sometimes people might want the flowers. They want to have that reminder that winter is coming to an end, and now the spring and the warm temperatures are coming. And so here are some very nice small trees for flowers. And here's one that was trained to be more of a round individual. And this is very common in the spring when you have a lot of flowers for these different magnolias. So things to consider the flowers. Or sometimes you might want to work with a special form. So here are some of the weeping mulberries or weeping trees in just a yard where you can have a nice areas to sit. You don't want to have some big trees, but you like more of the tree form and shapes. And so in this case, the weeping tree might lend itself better to the location and the area. Or espalier, if the area is very narrow and having branches spread out might not be ideal. Then there are the training of the trees to look to grow kind of in a two-dimensional against a wall. Will this be a tree? The answer is yes, because you can keep training it up. Obviously, it is not going to have a natural form. This is completely artificial. But sometimes this is going to be a good purpose for the tree. We want to kind of soften this wall, maybe prevent graffiti in certain areas. That can be a nice reason. And so sometimes with a little bit of work or a lot of work, you can definitely open up and train this to do its part. And so espalier for very narrow areas, drought tolerant landscapes. So we have here the California friendly gardens with a lot of the drought tolerant plants. And so Palo Verdes have become very popular because of that. I would caution you because it happened to many trees, which is unfortunate, that they were established, they were very happy, they were very healthy, and then all of a sudden, people decided to change their yard to a water conservation, and the tree was not on the list for the water conservation plant palette. And they took away the tree. They removed it because it did not fall into the water conservation plan. An established tree, whether it's a drought tolerant tree or not, is already requiring less water because the roots are already way out into the substrate. It's taking water from wherever it can. And so by the person removing that big tree, established tree, and putting a brand new one, the new one is going to require regular water for many years before you can wean it away from the water. And so in the immediate time, they are going to be using a lot more water than what the other tree would have needed. Plus, you have taken away the shade, you have taken away the pollution removing component of that big tree, the canopy, and a bunch of other great benefits. So just be aware of that. Could you have taken this tree, planted it, let it grow big, and then as this one grows big, slowly get rid of the other one? Yeah, that could have been something good. So don't remove trees just because they are not drought tolerant or they claim that they're not drought tolerant. An established tree is going to be a lot more drought tolerant in many cases than the ones being planted until they become established, and that's many years. Here we have a small peppermint willow in the front yard, and then we have an ash tree as a street tree. So here's a perfect individual for this small space, or a mini orchard. So as mentioned before, many people might want some fruit trees. Could you design an area, a front yard, to have many fruit trees so that they can have an array of different things for them to eat? The answer is yes. You can designate a special place or a space and width for each of the trees, and with care and culture, they can achieve having several fruit throughout the year by having a different array of fruit trees. So here's some kumquats. I think there's some avocados and some apples and a few other things. So the mini orchard concept is something that you also should keep in mind, as well as having tree in a grove. So putting more than one, even 3 or 4 small trees will create a mini grove, mini cluster of trees to kind of create a forest. Or the extreme big, I'm going to call this a big giant bonsai. So an intense pruning for in this case, where they have definitely done a lot of work in shaping this tree. Every single branch is probably in the right place. And trained, you can see some lines where they have moved some branches to the right location and keep it until they become hard, and then they're going to remain there forever. So in this house, it obviously looks very nice, and with a lot of care, this can be achieved. And different types of palm trees. And I want to point out something very important here. If you notice, we have a very nice big palm tree here. And as you move to the right, this one is a little bit smaller. The next one is a little bit smaller, and then they keep stepping down in size. So what's the problem here? The problem is that this is where the sun comes up. So this very front palm is taking all of the sunlight and is shading the one next to it. So that's why it's going to be a little bit smaller. And this one is shading the one next to it. So it's going to be a little bit smaller. And so they gradually shade each other until the one that is on the further extreme away from the sunlight is not getting enough sunlight to build its resources. So it's going to be a runty, stunted palm. So there's nothing wrong here with a palm, except that they were probably planted way too close. When I create a palm grove, that's fine, but be aware that the plants, the trees will be competing with light, and if some kind of shading occur to the neighboring plant, it's going to have some kind of negative impact on them. So it was kind of interesting to see them. They were probably planted at the same time, but it's just the amount of light that gave preference to the ones in front that are very happy and very healthy and very robust or very husky, whereas the one runty ones are on the other side where the sun is not hitting them or is not enough to make them really happy. So be aware of this competition. Could you have pruned some of the ones in front to allow for better light? The answer is yes, but in this case, I don't think they've done that. So just be aware of how the sunlight and the light can affect the plants. Here's a view from the different angle. So you can see the ones on the far left are beautiful and green and big, and they keep getting wimpier and runty and even yellowish in color because they're just not happy. Here's some more very nicely trained and placed avocado trees, even avocados in a small yard. If you prune them correctly, you train them correctly, they are not going to interfere or cause any serious problem. So here is a tree that was helps the landscape instead of being detrimental. Here is a cedar tree. Again, I would necessarily like to have it in more space, but in this case, they have raised the canopy or the bottom leaves so that they have some nice clearance. And now the tree is doing its a very good job. So it is providing a lot of beautiful shade to the house, as well as a screen, as well as a very nice uh, view of the tree. So you can work with it. It can definitely do its thing. Uh, and or here is a grove of eucalyptus. I would not necessarily plant them this close, especially all this eucalyptus, but in this case, it works. They have created a nice mini forest. And when you then add a very different shape of a tree here, the Brazilian pepper, so you have a mini grove. It pretends that you're walking through the forest as the person is going to go into the house. So here's a very good use for some of these very tall trees to create a mini grove, and or very high canopy trees such as this hackberry in the east side of Long Beach. Very nice clearance, very nice, very nicely shaped. So none of the vehicles are going to have any kind of damage, and or the pedestrians will not have any problem walking underneath it. The branches are well spaced, so this tree is very happy, very safe, and going to provide a lot of shade and a lot of good benefits for this area. And or sometimes there's going to be the mini forest. I would like to say that this house is no longer there. Sorry, the house is there, the trees are no longer there. So we have the Araucaria columnaris very close together, but this is creating a very nice woodland forest. So you have a lot of different conifers here and there, creating a very nice screen, as well as kind of having them as a background to the house, and a lot of very pyramidal, very narrow trees. So we have, unfortunately, the trees were now getting too big. There was some damage to the sidewalk, the foundation. So they're now gone, and I think that also helped or influence some of these other trees that I think are also gone now. So looking at it from a different angle, we have from the sidewalk, so you can see the trees here, and then we have a down redwood, which I don't think is there anymore, and then you have a couple of other cedars and junipers, which I don't think is there. So either somebody new came there and they changed the landscape, or they decided to change it completely, remove the trees because they did not like that privacy. But this is what I like to refer to as a very nice woodland forest with just a few trees here and there, and giving you a lot of those pines conifers that you will see if you go up higher into the mountains. And then that's a view of the driveway with a lot of the ground covers that you normally see somewhere underneath the forest canopy. You'll see a lot of those herbaceous plants running all over the ground. And then, so that's a different view. And then the deciduous tree that will allow a little bit more light during the winter, and then kind of shade the house during the summer. And I think that's the last one. So are there any questions? And many things for you to consider, all very, very important. So I'll put this as a final, just in case you want to write remember some of the things that you should be asking us. Why is this tree being planted? Because the last thing we want is for somebody just to make a hole, dig a hole, plant the trees, and 10 years, 20 years later, the tree is interfering with something, and now we're going to have to remove it and kill it. So that's not what we want. We want to make sure that if a tree goes in the ground, it has a purpose, it has a nice place, it is the right tree, and that tree is going to be there for my grandchildren and their grandchildren and everybody else's grandchildren and many generations. So are there any questions on anything?
No.
Nope. All right, so let me then I'll stop recording, and I'll see you guys next time.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
All right.